So I just asked all the artists to start by saying your name and letting me know where we're having this conversation.
Okay. Kendal Henry, and we're having the conversation in my home, my apartment in New York City, Long Island City. But it's also my sanctuary, my place of rest and thinking, because I do travel a lot for work.
I would like to start by having you talk about how you have come to call yourself an artist.
Well, technically, I'm an artist because I went to art school. I went to School of Visual Arts. And that was actually telling someone this yesterday. It was one of these years were like the most fantastic years of my life, because I got to do anything I thought of, I got to actually do it. And so no matter what you're doing, go to art school and just sort of stay there for a couple of days, a couple of years, and just, you know, be an artist. So yeah, went to art school. So I have a degree that says I'm an artist. But besides that, I think it's the way I think and the way I've always thought, and having creativity be the forefront of everything that I do. That's how I kind of define myself as an artist, and that's whether I make art physically or not, then I will forever be an artist because of that.
What is artistic thinking?
Well, I like to say creative thinking instead of artistic thinking. I like to, and looking back at some of my little images when I was a kid, some of the stories I heard growing up from my parents and from my family, it was all about using some sort of creative method of solving a problem. I remember, like, I had my bedroom, I needed a place to put my clothes. And instead of trying to go find some sort of box or shelf or something, I made a set of drawers from some old boxes that I found in the trash can. You know, and it sort of worked really well. I designed it, I painted it, and, you know, I made my own furniture from like boxes. So it was sort of like, I didn't have money, I didn't have wood, I didn't have the typical things to make a dresser. So I used what I had, and I found what I had, and I made it. And so that kind of way of thinking is what I, you know, an artist is you know, utmost sort of challenge is to use his or her creativity to make anything happen. And that's sort of my mantra, if you call it that.
Do you consider yourself a maker of things?
I consider myself a maker of things, but the things always have a purpose way beyond the thing itself. So I would kind of make a thing to relay a message or relay some sort of idea, and use that as a catalyst for that idea. So it's about the process of making the thing. It's not, and the thing is not the end product, but it's sort of another step to another idea.
And what kind of ideas do you typically explore?
I like, well, first of all, let me just say, I never work alone. Everything I do is collaborative. And so the only thing that's consistent in my artwork, and I do these quotes because, you know, is that it's always collaborative, and not necessarily with another artist, but with just another person or other people, and it always comes in multiples. There's always more than one iteration of the art product.
Why is that? Why have you set those parameters for you?
Well, it's not something I set. It's something I sort of discovered that happens. So I don't know where some sort of psychological, you know, research or something to figure that out. But I just realized, looking at all the work that I've done, I'm like, oh, it always happens. Well, I like the collaborative thing. That's a natural for me. That's necessity for me. But the multiples thing, it's sort of like, because I always see that there's more than one way to do something. So I like to explore as much as possible how that can be done. So I think that's where it comes from. But I never say, well, I want to do 5 or 6 or 12 or 50. It just happens to be that because there's so many different ways to see one thing. So that's how it happens.
So you put the quotations around artwork. And so could you just expand more on why there's
the quotations?
Quoted?
Because I think I always have to try to explain, and a lot of what the people I deal with are non-artists. So when I say art, immediately people have the idea of it may be a painting, it may be a sculpture, it may be something that is physically manifested, designed by an artist. So I do this because I have, it's unlimited for me. It could be a ringtone, it could be sort of a verbal idea, it could be, so it doesn't have any, it could be a light movement thing, it could be anything, it could be a dance. So I like to keep it open. So I say this just so as a means of, I have to explain what this means. So
do you think that labeling it, labeling your, the process and the manifestation of your practice art limits it in some way? Is that the hesitation for the label?
Yeah, because it's like when you say it, people have an idea of what you're talking about. They think they have an idea of what you're talking about, and you may not be talking about that at all.
Right.
But on the other end of that too is, I think people still think art is this thing over there, this luxury thing, this thing for these people. And sometimes that's cool. So you want to sometimes use that cool factor to get them to participate or get them to listen. So, using the word art, could work for and against you, but, the process will help you get people to understand what you're talking about.
Right.
So
you work in the public realm.
Yeah.
Why do you do that?
Well, you want the long story or the short story?
Whatever you want to give us.
Well, yeah, let me tell the mini long story.
The mini long version.
Yeah, so going back, I went to art school. And lovely years, and part of that was, we were able to have small exhibitions, and people who came to these exhibitions were peers, family, friends, and the people who knew what it is that you're talking about in your artwork, and that was nice. That was okay. But I always felt that something was missing. It's sort of like speaking to the converted already. You're doing this thing, it's art. The people who are seeing it has the art history background that you did, or know what you're dealing with in terms of an artwork. But I wanted to sort of reach these people that didn't care about art, know anything about art, don't give a horse's ass about it, and have this really interesting dialogue with them. Me being a creative person and them being just regular people, creative or not. Making art or making things that would engage and create this back and forth dialogue. So that's what really attracted me to doing the public art thing. And so I knew that in the back of my head while going to art school, but I didn't know how to realize it or make it real or even know where to go.
Right.
A chance encounter happened where I had to do some sort of work study program as part of my financial aid. And the school sent me to some financial aid office downtown in Manhattan. They had a book of places for artist types could work. And I ended up being at the Department of Cultural Affairs Percent for Art program. And they commissioned public art for city-owned property as part of the Percent for Art law. And I'd never heard of what public art was. I didn't know that existed. I had no idea. So I was like, it has art in it. Let me go for an interview. And it ended up being the most fantastic thing that I've ever done. I worked there as an intern, taking care of the slide registry. The slide registry is sort of where artists who are interested in doing public art would submit their images to be, considered. And
they have a massive slide registry.
They had I remember when I was there many years ago, they had about 4,000 artists in there, and some of the artists in there were my teachers in school, my instructors. So I was like, wow. So I was getting to see, other artwork, that artists were producing, not just in New York, but elsewhere, or not just in my school, but elsewhere. Right. So that was like a big plus. And so that was incredible. Then being in that department was very small. There were like 4 people doing 30 some odd projects. Even as an intern, I was allowed to do real managerial stuff. And then I realized, oh my goodness, these people are these artists or these cultural affairs people are commissioning artists to do artworks in schools that didn't have an art program. So this public artwork sort of replaced the art program in a way. So it had to really speak to the students and really engage them and really, take the place of a whole curriculum. And that really excited me. And from then on, I was like, oh my God, this is what I want to do. I want to make art that spoke to people who didn't care about, it's just sort of like a whole different language.
Right.
Sort of, I learned a new language all of a sudden,
right.
like that.
Yeah.
And so that was really exciting.
How do you do that? I'm really curious to know how you make art that speaks to people.
Well, if you're going to speak to someone, you have to understand what they're saying in the first place. You have to be able to speak literally to them. And this was really hard for me because I'm not a talker. I don't like talking to people. And I'm a really shy kind of person. And so to do a public art project, to do a public art piece, with me, it starts with the conversation.
Right.
I start with, when I go on when I do a project, I start with, we're going to do an artwork. But let's talk about some of the things that are on your mind, some of the things that you're interested in, that bothers you, that, whatever it is. And it just is a casual conversation. And throughout the years of doing this, I pull what people are saying and what they're not saying. And then I sort of lead the conversation, and then together we come up with an artwork.
Right.
And without putting parameters of what that would be or how it will take form, but it just sort of develops, and it happens very quickly. I've noticed that when you have a group of people together and you're having a conversation, what's on their mind, what they're passionate about comes to the forefront immediately. Whether it be their kid, whether it be the situation that's happening in the world, in their world, it just pops up.
Do you think it's something about, when you kind of use art to facilitate these conversations, do you think that has something to do with people being ready and willing to speak their passion so quickly because they're kind of in this sort of creative or passionate environment?
And I think when a creative person or just somebody's asking you, hey, sincerely, what's going on? How are you? And it's sincere,
right.
And people know when it's sincere,
right.
Then they'll tell you.
Yeah.
And sort of that's what I want. So I don't go in with anything, any preconceived anything. And I just go in as a person I'm really interested in people. And just saying, what's going on?
Yeah.
How are you doing?
Yeah.
And then it just all rolls out, and it's amazing. It's an amazing thing.
Yeah.
For an artist, for me as an artist, it's an amazing thing to just learn about an individual or just a group of people that I knew nothing about before.
And I think it's also something very fascinating about, kind of learning about the public or learning about a site through the people.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Because I work literally around the world, and what we know of the place, what we know of the place we may visit, may come out of books or written by some sort of scholarly person, and what you really how the place is experienced by the people who live there is always very different.
Yes.
So that's the voice I'm interested in hearing about. So as I have it, I don't tend to pick up a book and learn anything about the place that I'm going to initially.
Right.
I go blind, and sometimes deaf because I don't speak the language and whatever, and just start talking to whomever. And of course, that story would change depending on who you're talking to. If I'm talking to a whole bunch of artists, for instance, people who live, in the downtown area versus that'll all change. But that's fine. There are many different ways, many different angles in any story. So that's what I like to do, and that's how I like to work, and that's very, very exciting to me.
How do you go from the point of getting the conversation, the point of dialogue, to a place where you start to then realize something?
That process changes completely depending on where I am and how we're doing it and what we're doing. Let me give you some examples. Like, for example, in what country was this? In Tajikistan. And Tajikistan, a lot of people don't know where Tajikistan is, and of course. So I like to say it's one of the countries bordering Afghanistan, because we kind of know Afghanistan because we're fighting with them right now.
Right.
So Tajikistan is one of the countries bordering Afghanistan. It's used to be part of the Soviet Union many years ago. And so I went in, and I was having a conversation with, I announced, well, they announced this American guy is coming, and he wants to just talk and maybe do an art project as a result. So you have people who are artists, who are people who are just curious, people who are just part of the organization that may have invited me. Everybody's is part of the process. I said, well, what are some of the issues that you've tell me about Tajikistan, and this particular place was Dushanbe, the capital city. And we started talking, and they're like, oh, well, we're a beautiful city. And I said, yeah, I was driving around, I saw these huge water fountains. They have these massive water fountains in the main strip. And I said, yeah, I could see that because you're just beautiful. And they're like, well, yeah, well, it's nice, but. And I was like, uh-huh. And it sort of started, they talking about the water, because I brought up this water fountain that I saw, because they said it was a beautiful city. And it's like, well, we have, Tajikistan is 98% mountainous. And when you have mountains, you have snow caps, and you have, when the spring comes, it all melts, and all water comes everywhere. Right. And there's, creeks and rivers and streams and lakes and stuff. But we don't have access to our water. I was like, what? You have all this water? You have fountains? What? And they're like, well, the thing is, the government sells the water to neighboring countries, and what is left is it's sort of divided by the different neighborhoods. So, for example, let's say this was Tajikistan, and this building would get water from 12 to 1 every day. That's it. The building across the street get it from 1 to 2. So you would get your allotment, your time period where you would get water.
Oh my gosh.
And then I was like, oh, okay, because I realized it because I was in an apartment there, and my water allotment bill was between like 12 and 1, I think. So every day I had to get the buckets and fill up the water so I could flush the toilet and take a shower, and I bought bottled water so I didn't have to boil the water. But so the water is an issue. And then one of the participants said, well, yeah, well, that's just life. We don't have to. What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, and the whole conversation stemmed around water. And I said, well, let's talk about this. Is it because I take advantage of water? I come from a place where I turn the tap, and I don't do it, but I could stand underneath the shower for an hour, and it'll be hot, scalding water.
Yes.
And so your sort of perception of water and my perception of water is very different. And so we're gonna do an artwork, because you're so passionate about this water situation. Do artworks, again, the multiples, about water. And so I think we did 12 projects about water. And that sort of spoke to a lot of the different angles of the water situation. Like I did something called, we canned water. We put water in cans, and we gave it away for free. So we had about like 50, 60 cans of canned water that we gave away. The thing is, in Tajikistan, people don't use canned anything. So to get the water, they had to either purchase an expensive can opener or go through a whole rigmarole to access the water.
Right.
And the act of doing that was a statement about the water situation in Tajikistan. We came up with something called a water bar, where we use empty water bottles to make like a bar like you'd see in a bar. And went to the market, offered people free water, but they had to sample different waters from different regions, and as part of your free water, you say which one tastes the best. So we had water from the US, water from Tajikistan, Asian water, Russian water, and we had a random Australian water, and asked people which one tastes the best. And I think the majority liked the American water. The least favorable water was Tajik water, Tajikistan water. What they didn't know was all the same water. It was all Tajik water. So it was a psychological. People sort of felt what they had there was not as good as sort of like the grass is greener on the other side situation. But they were all drinking Tajik water, but because it was labeled something else, it tasted better to them.
Yeah.
Another one was sort of being self-reliant and using a lot of the funnels and that some of the buildings had. Created a water tower that, a very, very cheap, water tower that would take rainwater, store it in the body of the tower, and people could use it to sort of water their plants or brush their teeth, and so they have their own water source. So these are just a few examples. So just this idea from this conversation about water came up with all these different artworks that we ended up doing, and with very little money and in about 10 days.
How do you, what's the public's or your audiences or the participant, however you want to describe, your collaborator, how do you measure the impact that the project has?
Well, it depends on what the goal that is set for what that is. For the water project I just spoke of, it was about initiating conversation, having people talk about their situation. So that was the goal. And when it gets on the news, then you're like, okay, so people who needs to hear it are hearing it. Whether to do something about it is another story. Right. But it's my goal is always try to get a conversation started about through the artwork or through the process of making the artwork. Because it's sort of like, if you don't know there's a problem, or if you don't know it's an issue, then how are you gonna, how are you gonna start to think about resolving it? So that's how that happens. That's the sort of the goal of all this, is usually to start a conversation. The artwork, the process is not the end point ever. It's always to lead to something else.
Then that's a trend that runs through all of your work.
That is correct. Yeah.
So, I'm wondering how you've got all these amazing rugs and wall hangings and art from all these places that you've been to. I'm curious how travel plays into your practice, and how you decide on locations.
Okay. I've always been interested in travel. I always like being somewhere else and experiencing another people, another way of seeing things. I think other cultures, other types of people have different ways of seeing things and thus different ideas. And I like to share my ideas, and I like to hear other people's, and then share what I learned and give it to somebody else, and let that whole thing happen. So it's. And in terms of how I pick a place, because I like to travel, I've been to a lot of the typical sort of places that everybody goes to, the big cities and stuff like that. And so what attracts me more is places that people have not been to, that we know nothing really about. And that's what I like. I like to, if it's, I go to Russia a lot, but though I've been to the main cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, I like to go to the tiny little villages and the out-of-the-way places that takes like 24 hours to get to, because one flight and train and a bus and that kind of thing. And what that sort of reminds me, or what it sort of reiterates in my thinking, is that whether it's a big city like New York City, or like a podunk sort of Russian village in Siberia, people want the same things. People have the same issues. People have the same needs and worries and cares, and we're all the same. It's like, it's ridiculous. It's like we have the same, social issues, and we're all the same people. And so me coming from like this little Caribbean island that has 150,000 people, and it's 28 square miles, St. Lucia. I think they're having a storm right now, and then going to a place like Russia, where they don't even know that part of the world, and sort of realizing, well, in Siberia, for example, and like wow, we're the same people. That I think if more people realize that we are all indeed the same people, we would have less issues. I just came up with that just now. I just think, yeah, I just realized that yeah.
I'm trying to think, where should I go now that you dropped that one? Well, I'm going to start with a more obvious question. How has the travel informed your concept of the public?
Well, there's a lot of ways I think to go about that. When I travel as a Black, for obvious reasons, I cannot hide that, American male person. And so I, for the lack of a better word, I represent America. I represent Black people when I go to these places. And it's interesting because a lot of the places I go to, they may have never seen a Black person, and it's obvious because other than on television or on the internet or something, and their perceptions are very skewed. Most people think I know a lot of rap artists. Most people think I play basketball and that sort of thing, and no. So people have perceptions of what being an American is. There's always a point during the process where it's sort of like, when people are very relaxed about, they see I'm just a relaxed kind of person, and that questions start coming, about America, about being Black and all that kind of thing. And it's a very interesting and candid conversation because that allows me to go the other direction.
That's right. To
sort of ask about what is it like about Muslims. I learned so much about being a Muslim in some of these countries, about being Russian, especially around, when we had the Cold War, and all these different stereotypes that we hear, and how true are they, and it's that alone is incredible to me, and sort of like, so I always leave with, again, reiterating that, we're the same people. All these things that we hear is not necessarily true. We just have to, have that conversation and be open and talking, and it comes out, and it's just, it's the coolest thing.
It is the concept of public space must also be very different.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Everywhere you go.
Yeah, exactly. Some public spaces are where people live, literally. The home is just to sleep, and things happen in the public environment. Everything happens in the public environment, so it belongs to everybody. Whereas other places, the public environment belongs to no one. And there's this sort of quasi-public private space within their homes, or courtyards around their homes. And so when I start thinking about public art and doing art for the public, it's important for me to understand from the locals what that means to them. What is public? Is it really, my perception of public is very different coming from here. So that sort of leads the charge as well. It's like defining what it means to be public for them.
And then
because you'd be surprised how in certain places the public is only men. Because women don't do that. They don't go there, or they're not surrounded by these areas, and so your audience is completely different there. Other places, the public deals with a certain class of people within the community, and so you have to think about that as well, and because sometimes it doesn't mix, and so it's all community. What community means and what public means is always changing. And if it's something I've learned, is sort of how do they define community, and in turn, how do they define public?
And, I was unfamiliar to you until you went there, right? And then you come back to, say, New York. How do those experiences translate to what you do when you come back home?
Well, coming back home is sort of more of the moment to really, because when I'm there, I'm there. I don't have time to sort of contemplate what the situation is. and that's what happens when I come back home.
Right.
Sort of debrief myself and sort of like, okay, I just went to this place and I sort of came and this bombardment of information, and this is where it's processed here.
Mm-hmm.
This is where it's processed.
Right.
And once it's processed, it's taken to the next place or the next project or that experience is taken to that other endeavor.
Right.
And whether it be a way of approaching something, a way of looking at something in a different way or a different angle. So that's what happens. But I try to be very, very present wherever I am at any given moment, and get my full attention to the situation and not be thinking about, the other projects that I have working at home. And so I always like to do that. Otherwise, it doesn't work for me because I get distracted.
How do you document your practice?
Well, I like to do I like to do a blog per project.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a lot of blogs out there, just to show, I share.
Right.
If in case anybody wants to try this, then it's out there.
Right.
Just look at the blog, because what the blog does, it sort of shows I got there.
Right.
I'm here. I don't know what's going on. People asking me, what are you going to do? I'm like, I don't know. And they're like, what do you mean you don't know? You only have a week. And I was like, I have no idea. Who are you dealing with? I have no idea. So it starts with the I don't knows.
Yeah.
And then it from day and every meeting is sort of documenting photography and little interviews, and in the whole process is documented. So by the time the end of the blog, you see the product, but there's always, like I said before, the product the process is as important as the product,
mm-hmm.
and what the product leads to is as important as everything else.
Right.
So yeah, through blogs that I documented, and you see the stories, and you know, if you follow it, you don't know what's going to happen next. It's sort of like, like reading a story. I don't know what's going to happen next, and sometimes it's surprises. It's always a surprise, and but I think it's always successful because it's about the engagement more than anything, and it's about the dialogue. So whether the end artwork is something worthy of being in MoMA, that's another story. But it's about the process and getting there for me.
Well, it makes me think about, what you were saying about blogging. It makes me think of the idea of presence, and what you were saying about it's really important for me to be where I am at that particular moment. And so, is there something about the blog that gives you that sense of presence, of, being there then at the time? Yeah.
Because I like to encourage, though I'm the primary writer of the blog, I like to encourage others to participate as well and put their thoughts and of the process, and it's always unedited. So if somebody's like, I cannot stand that guy, he is like making my life miserable, it's going to stay in that blog. Because my job now is to change that perception of that person from what I'm doing, and hopefully at the end of the blog it's going to be a different story. So but I also want people to, if they're interested, to be there with me as I'm going through the process, because I don't know how it's going to end, and sort of be there, be very present, and not be something that has like a story as a beginning and I know what the end is, so I could write the beginning to make the end make sense. It's sort of so that's how I like to work it.
Sounds like trust is a really important aspect of it. Especially if you're starting from this place where it's like, I don't know how this is going to go. For a lot of people, that's a very kind of unstable position to begin from. I think I'm agreeing with you that I think it's quite a productive space. I prefer to start from there than thinking that I know. But for people who don't start that way, I think that is a bit frightening.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
It's terrifying. Because basically, somebody is saying, I'm going to invite you to come to this place you have never been before. You don't know exactly who you're going to be working with. And at the end of what is going to be about 7 to 10 days, you're going to do a project that the press is going to come and cover and write about and blah, blah, blah.
Oh, really?
So you're like, okay, So what that forces me to do is pay attention. Okay? Pay attention and get people really involved with the process. Because, the process is the process, and it works.
Right.
You know, if you're gonna really, if you're asking someone to, if you're asking someone a question, you want an answer from them, a truthful, trustful answer from them, you got to pay attention to what they're saying,
Right.
And take all that knowledge that you have, and find a way of engaging them in telling you and engaging you to come up with a way, again, that language, visual language, of sharing that conversation and that with these other people
Right.
who weren't part of that, but who is reflected in some of that conversation. So you have to pay attention,
Yeah.
you know, and that's what it is. You have to really, and that's why being present is so important. And I have to, you know.
And presence and attention, although they sound like, you know, we think we have a really familiar understanding or grasp of what those things mean, but one of the things that I've kind of realizing through this process in particular is that those things, you know, presence and attention, are really kind of hard to come by. You know,
Yeah.
like, and also it's a training of oneself to be present, I feel, and to be attentive. Somewhere along the line, I guess maybe through so much media, we become so distracted.
Yeah, multitasking, you know. As I'm talking to you, I'm sort of texting over there with my hand, and then, you know, thinking about this, thinking, yeah.
Yeah, and that ability, which I think is an incredible ability, to be able to kind of be in these multiple places at once, but it also, I think, really lessens or mutes the human capacity to be present, to be somewhere, to listen, you know. And I mean, I just wonder if you come up, if you contend with that in your interactions with other people.
Yeah, I think I've always, maybe I'm good at this because maybe it has something to do with other than me being, you know, whatever, but I've always been a listener. I always like to hear what people are saying. You know, I always like to sort of engage that way. So that's not even, it's not hard work for me to pay attention. And I'm interested. I'm like really interested. I'm one of those rare people who wants to see your vacation pictures, you know, who really want to see where you went to, and asking about stuff that's in the pictures and stuff, because I'm really interested. Because I think maybe I came from I grew up in sort of like a homogeneous society where everybody is practically all related in the little island there. And, you know, we all look the same, we all have the same histories and stuff like that, and I, you know, got away from that, and I came to this place where everybody's different, and so I just wanted to know more, and that sort of stuck with me. And then going out of here and going to other places and wanting to know more, that's sort of incredible to me. But also to just my interest in solving a problem, and, you know, there's that saying, there's more than one way to skin a cat. I don't know where that came from, but when are you going to skin a cat? But whatever. But just that idea of, and I think I always go through my career knowing that, oh, there is always a solution. I always believe that there is a solution. I may not know what it is right now, but there's always a solution, because again, it's reiterated over and over again. There's so many different ways to see something by so many different kinds of people, and so I don't know if I answered your question, but
no,
yeah.
You did, and I'm going to follow up with another one, because I think that in art school, and this is something that I got in particular to art school, was this kind of like knowledge about other artistic practices, right? So for example, you know, the notion of publicity was a big part of the curatorial education that I received, you know, thinking a lot about public and audience and artist, and really thinking about the curator and the artist as these kind of tandem entities that, you know, create these spaces, and that these spaces are these abstract, you know, kind of forms that you can kind of put, you can create these spaces through multiple means, right? Through various means. You learn about the trajectory of public art. You know, like, this is what public art was at this particular time, and this is what the contention is. And I think that you have to kind of contend with notions of community when you're talking about public art. Issues of neighborhood, and, you know, just have to take into account the person that's implied in something being in the public. So you learn about these different kind of strategies towards putting art in public space, and then why they were successful or unsuccessful based on the way a person kind of interacted or did not interact with them. And there's these different schools of thought that develop around notions of public art and where we are in a contemporary sense. And your approach in terms of, creating these kind of listening devices, or this kind of these moments for listening, do you consider that something that is generally missing from the process of creating a piece of public art, that's traditionally not
exactly? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And there's so many ways I want to answer that question. Let me just think for a second. I was fortunate to be asked to, I was recommended to be part of there's an organization called Americans for the Arts. And that's an umbrella organization that sort of is in charge of a lot of policy and with arts all around the board, all across America, not just visual arts, but for performing arts and music and whatnot. And there's a subcategory of that is a public art network. And part of the network is a public art council. And so I was asked to serve as a recommended, and somebody recommends you, and then the membership votes, and if you are accepted, then you go on a ballot, and then the field votes, and then you become an officer of the Public Art Council. I was fortunate to be an officer for 6 years. I could only serve 2 3-year terms, and then I can't anymore. So those issues that you sort of just described there was paramount in a lot of the conversations about public art throughout the United States. And people, a lot of there are about, let's say, 500 organizations that commission public art in the U.S.
Okay.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of money behind public art. So there's a lot of different processes and ways of trying to get that perfect public artwork. And people are coming up with how do you, and a lot of it just doesn't work. So my controversial thing that I say is, I think, I'd say 85% of the public art that's commissioned is mediocre at best. And that's a result of the process.
Right.
And a lot of these processes say that they want to speak to the community, but they're not doing it, or it just doesn't happen. Sometimes the process allows for someone to speak to the community, but then they're a stakeholder that is connected to a particular group of that community, and so whatever. But it just doesn't work. And so, mind you, I worked for 2 agencies, governmental agencies, to commission public art. So I'm not just talking out of my ass here, but so I know why it worked and why it didn't work. Right. So I just took it upon myself that for me to really get this to work, I had to pay attention and figure out a way to get people to be comfortable about telling me what I needed to hear, so I could create an artwork that would be successful in their eyes. Right. Okay. So coming, so it took a bit of time to try to figure out how to do that. Right. And how to engage, and how to speak to, how to, because if people aren't comfortable with you, then they're not going to be telling you stuff. Right. And they're not going to, they're going to be closed. If they don't trust you, like you said, if there's a level of trust there, then it's like, how is this guy going to really, relay what I'm trying to get across here? Right. So that yeah. So it and I don't know that my answer is the right answer necessarily, but for now, it's working, and I sort of look for many other ways of making it work better. But it starts with the listening thing again. Right. And
So, here we are talking about, I mean, this whole kind of, the phrase of social engagement is what has brought us together for this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And, I also feel like, just kind of following up on that last question, that there's also these new phrases that pop up, through the cycle, of that continuum, of sort of getting beyond whatever.
Trendy.
Right. And part of this project, the major part of this project, is trying to set up some sort of aesthetic, for lack of a better term, of what socially engaged art practice is. And I wonder what the power is in the choice of words when you're describing people like you, who are cultural producers in a creative field, are artists, they have the degrees, but they're just kind of working in a way that's, you still need to put the quotations around, you know what I mean? Like, how important are those choice of words?
I think it's very important, because even now, I have trouble when somebody asks me what do you do, and that changes depending on who I'm talking to, mind you. So to sort of get them to try to, and sometimes my role changes, frankly.
Right.
So I always stick with artists, because that's a little broader than anything else. Some others I say, I'm a curator.
Right.
That's a little loose.
Right.
Public art curator, public art coordinator, arts administrator, public art admin. So I have a whole bunch of ones that I use. But whatever I say, I have to sort of explain.
Right.
And try to get people to understand what I'm trying to do in that particular situation. But yeah, maybe we need to come up with a new one. Maybe we don't. I don't know. But it's what we're doing, and I think I know some of the people you're talking to about this. It sort of goes beyond a title, a single title anyway.
Right.
And even that doesn't even cover it.
Exactly.
So what do you do? I mean, so how maybe, I don't.
It's, well, I think for me, it's about trying to sort of trying on a particular methodology, that is reminiscent in some way of what my idea of social engagement would be. And it starts from a place for me, just like kind of identifying tropes that already exist in, what is commonly considered the public realm. For instance, the internet. It's like, oh, well, what do people do online? They share. Okay, we keep talking about sharing. What do you mean by that? Like, how is this social platform shifting what we mean when we say share? What our expectations are when we're sharing, and does it have physical, or does it have implications back into the real world? Then it's like, well, is the virtual kind of forcing, or are we increasingly moving towards the virtual even in our physical space, just by virtue of the language that we're using now, because so much of it is co-opted to digital language.
Yeah.
I mean, these are just kind of, the things that I'm thinking about, and just even trying to conceive of what is public art.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
Where is it? It's so many things, not to negate one or over the other, but it's just so many things. But the challenge then is how you can evaluate what the art is in a particular way of working, if it's not so much about the object and the process, or the object or the thing, but it's about this sort of process way of working, this intangible,
Well, evaluation, that word has always been, in public art particularly, is sort of like, how do you even evaluate?
Right.
And that for years we were trying to figure out, and of course it comes down to like how do you gauge success of something that you've done? And I don't know the answer to that necessarily.
Right.
But in trying to reach an answer, I try to have all the things that I'm involved with, all the collaborations that I'm involved with, have a number of different components to it. First being the process of engagement, being a sounding board, or being sort of a catalyst for people to express something that's an issue, not necessarily a negative issue, but just an issue. And then through that creating an artwork, and not necessarily an object, but some tangible something. So, and then that tangible thing be the best that it can be in terms of an artwork. So it could be judged as an artwork and being, oh, that's a great artwork.
Right.
And if that's, let's say you only experience the engagement part, then you get something from that, and you don't experience anything else, that could be enough.
Right.
Let's say you only experience the physical art part, then it's solid as an artwork, and if that's all that came out of that for you, then that's fantastic as well. But taking those two things and sort of taking that next step in where it be a conversation that changes things, or that gives people a different perspective, and that's great as well. So keeping these three things, and usually there's a lot more, but I can't think of them right now. These three things, and getting that out of the process of being involved in the overall artwork, I think it's important. So you may not get it all, but if you get part of it, then there's something to get.
Right.
There's something to take with you. So that's is important to me.
You talk about commissioning, as a part of the public art process, and how has this notion of commissioning, which is typically the way art ends up in public, through a commissioning process, when the practice is about conversation and discourse, and it's not about physicality per se, how does that adjust commissioning, this idea of commissioning?
That's a very, 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 very important question. And it's funny you because the project that I have in mind is that Fred Wilson project.
Ah, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And for the purpose of the camera there, Fred Wilson was commissioned to do a project for the Indianapolis Trail, which is a new sort of cultural trail in Indianapolis, and a number of artists were selected. And he, in his way of working, he did an artwork that recontextualized an existing sculpture in the central Indianapolis, which is part of a monument in central Indianapolis. And it was an image of, within a menagerie of images in this monument, there was a single African American freed slave that was part of that menagerie. And he removed, and this free slave was in a seating position, hand raised, reaching up to justice, the image of justice, or the figure that represented justice, with broken shackles. And so he removed, not physically, but conceptually removed the figure and recreated that figure. And instead of sitting down, he sort of looks like he's moving forward. And instead of a shackle in his hand, he had a flag that represented of his own making, that represented the African diaspora. Okay, so the project never happened, or the project is not going to happen. Now, the purpose of that project was not about the object. It was about the conversation that needed to happen in that place in Indianapolis.
Right.
So the artwork was meant to be a catalyst for conversation, and that was what it was for. To people to ask, what is this, and why is this, and why is this, a whole bunch of questions. But it didn't get to the point where, well, the conversation started to happen before the piece ended up happening.
Right.
And it was a very uncomfortable conversation for people to have. And the voices that were heard loudest, those smaller group of people, allowed the project not to happen. So when commissioning an artwork, one always begins with the, what do you want the art to do? With that question. Sometimes you want it to bring attention to a downtown or a building, or you want it to be a tourist attraction. Sometimes you want it to sort of be a celebration of the artist. Sometimes you want it to embellish an ugly building or make something prettier. All these are valid reasons. Sometimes you go beyond all that and you say, well, there's something going on here and we need to have a conversation about what this is. And that's what I want the artwork to do. And that's when the artwork is most provocative and most interesting and most, amazing as a public artwork, is when it does that. It doesn't end at, it doesn't have just the one purpose, but it sort of, its purpose is to engage other purposes.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
Right.
So, and that's what this project did, and that's why it was brilliant. And the world is at a disadvantage because this project is not realized.
Right.
Which is unfortunate.
Right.
But when I'm commissioning an artwork, it's sort of, I want to do ones like that. That sort of does that. That sort of becomes that gets people talking.
Right.
But unfortunately, if the right people aren't there to guide that conversation or allow that conversation to happen, then the easiest thing to do is to shut it up.
Right. Just to kind of
just to say, well, okay, this is getting a little too heavy for me here. Shut the hell up. Let's just not talk.
Right.
And that's what happened in that situation. And it has happened, or it has happened in many different situations as well. But that's the latest one that I was involved with. So I'm sort of bringing that up.
Right. Well, I mean, and that is, to me, shows the hesitation on behalf of commissioning entities to make themselves vulnerable to the types of discourse that are inherent. I mean, I feel like the project that you're speaking of, the conversation is nothing new. I mean, this is things that we lived within the notions of that came up about racism and how you represent bodies of color in terms of in public spaces. I mean, all these things, authorship. Those are always implicated, but it's I'm wondering about when. I don't even know if it's a question of when, but if it could be an explicit thing, where you are commissioned to generate this, it could be a conversation, the kind of conversation that you want to have. I feel like there's still a lag there on behalf of commissioning bodies to see objects almost as, like you were saying, a catalyst for something else, to actually address particular topics that I think people kind of, even if they don't necessarily want them to be on the table, they have something to say about it. Yeah. If it's put on the table. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, and I want to divide works into two different categories right now. There's permanent art, commissioning permanent art, and commissioning temporary art. With a permanent artwork, the process is a little different because typically the work has to survive in the environment for, like, let's say 50 years or so, or more. Temporary art, it could be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, it could be a composition, it could be whatever. So to do that, so it's easier to do that, as we're describing here, in a temporary artwork, because people feel that this is happening now, it's very contemporary, this is a conversation, it's going to go away next week, or it's going to go away 2 months from now, we don't have to see this anymore. With a permanent artwork, to keep that conversation, that kind of conversation going, and people realizing, oh, with the temporary art, you could be like, okay, I could shut this up, and then it's be old news next month. Nobody's going to talk about it. Right. But to sort of have it in a permanent representation, and knowing that when I'm dead and gone, this is still going to be talked about. Right. This is still going to be an issue. Right. That's a little scary, and people don't want to have to deal with that. That's a lot to you have to find someone who's willing to be able to say, well, listen, I'm going to fight this fight here. Right. And because I know it's important. Right. people have jobs, people have lives, people have mortgages to pay, and so you're in a position where you're commissioning this work. You have a couple of bosses above you who's up for re-election soon, who don't want to have to deal with this stuff. You're not going to let it happen. That's the reality of the situation.
Right.
So so how do you so it's easier to do with a temporary artwork. People say it's here for let even in temporary artwork sometimes people want to shut it down really quickly because it may be just too much to talk about. But I always encourage conversation. If any one of my projects is controversial, I grab the opportunity to say, why is this controversial? Let's talk about all of these issues that are coming up.
Right.
Let's sit down and really talk about it.
Right.
Let's try to resolve it if we can, or let's get it on the table and let's agree to disagree. Whatever it comes out of it, let's do that, because that's what the art is supposed to do.
Right.
That is what the artist is supposed to do. The artist is in our society to engage, to really sort of bring up some of these issues and talk and make the world a better, not to sound all Disney-like, but make the world a better place tomorrow. That's our role.
Yeah.
Doctors are there to heal people, artists are there to engage these kinds of, everybody has a role in society, and that's our role.
You mentioned earlier several roles that you can play when you're describing your practice.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about artist, curator, arts administrator, public art coordinator, public art administrator.
Yeah.
Do you make a distinction between your artistic practice and what you do that would also make you an administrator?
No, I stopped that.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
Why you stopped that, and also. Let's start there.
Mm-hmm.
Why you stopped?
Yeah, like I said before, my thing is collaboration, whether it be with an individual or a group of people. I get off on that, and so right now I'm working on. I just finished a project up in Canada with 15 artists, and I collaborate. I was billed as curator for the purposes of this project, but I collaborate with every one of these artists.
Right.
With some of them, it was a 50-50 collaboration, where it's sort of, we sat down and realized the project together 50-50. With others, they already had an idea, and my public art knowledge as to how things work in an outside environment, a public environment, was put to that. That was my role in that. So within the one project, I was artist, I was just curator for a couple of people. I was collaborator completely with some others. So within all that, the role changes per individual, per situation.
Right.
I'm doing a very similar thing in Australia with 28 artists, and in that situation, I am the only artist, and I am an artist doing my own project. I am collaborating 50-50, 75-25, whatever. But it changes depending on who I'm working with, and I welcome that.
Right.
I welcome that.
Right.
And in the end, it is their work. If it's their work, in the end, it's our work. If it's our work, even that's not important to me. That credit kind of thing, I know that's a bad thing to say, but it's just not important to me.
Right.
I like to. It's all about getting the message out and getting that thing out. And if you never know it's me, that's fine.
Right.
That's cool.
Yeah.
It's all about the message and the process and the work, and that's what it's about.
When I have to write about, I'll write about your profile for the blog. And one of the things that I struggle with in the writing, because there are a few other artists that are also a part of this who, kind of also teeter the arts administration thing and maybe even feel more comfortable calling themselves administrators than artists, just because of all that, it's like a sticky situation to start, walking that line. And for me, it's not about that. It's more about I kind of want to get away from that whole administration thing. I think that administration is doing something totally different, but that there is a way to work as an artist that's very systemic, and it's about organization and creating spaces and creating systems that doesn't necessarily make it administration per se.
Yeah.
There are things that are administration
within that. Yeah.
You know what I mean? But you can also work as an artist within collaboration in a project minded perspective, that doesn't necessarily make you an administrator. But my challenge is when I'm writing about it, and to make that idea palpable to readers, is, well, then what is that distinction? What makes that art?
Yeah.
Yeah. What are the parameters that the artist is setting up, or how is the artist creating that notion for themselves and kind of moves them away from the administrative thing? Is that something that you do? Do you set parameters that say, okay, now if I do this, then I'm an administrator now. This is no longer an art project.
Yeah. For some of the projects that I do, some of the permanent public art commissions, I have to make that distinction because it means very exacting things.
Right.
So in my head, when I say I'm an administrator, when I'm in the administrator role, that's exactly what I'm doing.
Right.
I'm not involved with the creative anything of this work. I'm just making it happen. And when I was even when I was a public art administrator for the MTA and for DCA and for some of these other projects, I always broke that role. I always broke it because collaborating with an artist meant that, well, going back a little bit, selecting an artist for a project meant that I had to know the history of that artist's work, where they were coming from, everything that they've done, what they're doing, how they think, how their creative process works. So when I know that, and they come in with commission projects is always new stuff. It's sort of like newly created work.
Right.
And they come with, this is the idea for the project, and I'm like, well, knowing what I know about you, and if this is not good enough, this doesn't represent you, because a lot of artists is trying to change the way they work to please this other group of people, these other stakeholders that are not art people, who are, they're saying, well, I think this is what they want to hear. So this is a $100,000 project. I'm going to do what they want to, because I'm going to get that,
Right.
So that happens.
Yes.
So when I see that happening, then I'm no longer the administrator, because I'm like, well, you're not doing yourself a service here.
Right.
So I sort of kick into, well, I'm going to collaborate with you to do this.
Right.
And pull out of what you've done before and where you used to go, and sort of almost buffer you from all this other stuff that you don't need to hear about.
Right.
So it is a form of administration, and you're not going to see my name on the finished product as an artist collaborator, because I don't see myself as doing that.
Right.
But that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So I don't. It's sort of like a little. It's a little still like not.
Yeah, it's very much a gray thing. I think that it manifests differently for different people.
Yeah, I know some people who would never think of even doing that. Even if they know it's not the best the artist's work, they're just gonna let it happen.
Right.
And it'd be like, okay, well, you lose some, you win some, whatever. But I don't feel comfortable doing that. I want people to do the best that they can do. So I'm always pushing and questioning and why. And for public art, you can't take anything. Nothing could be arbitrary. So it's all of that. And so sometimes I don't make suggestions to change the artwork or the concept of the artwork, but making sure that the artist owns that concept.
Right.
And making that concept being realized the best that it can given the circumstances.
Right.
So that's that role that I play there.
Right. Well, I brought this up before we were rolling camera, but I want to sort of culminate this conversation by talking about the notion of generosity, because I'm really interested in that idea as it relates to social engagement. That within the interaction, exchange, or conversation, that there's this aspect of generousness that's a part of it. That's either the impetus for it or as a product of it in some way. Somehow generosity is created. How do you see the idea of generosity or generousness kind of playing out in the work that you do?
I think it's paramount because I am where I am because people were very, very generous with information. When I worked for the MTA or DC, when I had a real day job, regular job, and I like to travel, I would go on vacation and I'd find these people who did the similar things that I did. And I'd be like, hey, you know, I'm here, can I talk to you about what you do? And let's exchange, let me tell you what I do. And people were like, yeah, you know, I never had a negative or a no or a second of indecision. It was always yes. So so I wanted to always give back, be as generous as I can with any and everything that I do. Whether it be providing information, whether I give a talk and people are like, oh, I'm really interested in hearing about this, here's my email address. Or whether it be I work on a collaborative project and I'm gone from this country or this city or this place, always in contact. If you have questions 2 years from now, please contact me. And so, and I don't think that's a special to me kind of thing. I think it's sort of like a product of like social media, social interaction, accessibility with the internet and everything. People are just all of a sudden just seem to be more open to sharing, and you know, sharing sometimes a little too much, but everybody share. I know, you know, just a sidetrack a little bit. You know, it's interesting because I have a cajillion family members in St. Lucia. And I never know what they're, you know, I never pick up a phone or, you know, call them because of whatever reason. But I know everything that's happening with them because of Facebook, you know, and I know everything about everything, you know, and so and I know who they're dating, who they shouldn't be dating, or whatever. But it's always like it's so that sort of is such a contemporary thing, I think, to share and to not keep things to yourself. And to be willing to want to engage in that way. And so yeah, I mean, I like to, you know, I'm just playing it forward for in sort of coming from my perspective, it's just playing it forward.
I like to think about it as, you know, sharing is also kind of opening up the idea of public, you know, even larger.
Exactly.
You know, things become, now all of a sudden things are just so much publicness out here, and privacy is like totally under siege.
Yeah. I mean, so
privacy is like, you know, people are really, you know, like the privacy mongers are really kind of shivering right now because everything is so public. Yeah,
and then what are you really hiding, really? I mean, so what is? Because I think when you put it out there, you know, you realize, oh, people are having the same situation that I'm having, and how are they dealing with it? Maybe I could deal with it the same way too, or maybe I could learn from that, and then it's sort of like that's how we know. And then knowing that, like I mentioned earlier, with the like I spent some time in Central Asia, where the majority of the people there are Muslim, and I did not know anything about being Muslim, but just that idea of sharing that information, I was like, oh, I get it. I understand why you are like how you are and how you see things. And that just enlightened me like nothing, like nobody's business. And just that idea of being able to share that way is just, well, it's made me like a sort of a better person. I'm sort of more compassionate, not like I wasn't before, but I'm more compassionate and I'm sort of more open to many different people and possibilities and situations. And what else is there to aspire to if not that, you know?
That's a great place to end it.
There you go.